Could you make King Kong?
I'd love to make King Kong.
Why?
Well, the original King Kong is my all-time favorite film, the 1933 version. I saw that when I was 10, which was the reason why I wanted to become a filmmaker, actually, is seeing King Kong. That's the ultimate escapist film. And I was working on a remake of King Kong for a while, and then Universal, the studio who were doing it, decided not to go ahead with it. And we had Lord of the Rings kind of in the wings at that point, so we were able to jump straight onto that project. But King Kong's great.
On December 5th, 2005, New York hosted the international premiere of Peter Jackson's King Kong, an epic, ambitious, big-budget retelling of one of the most enduring and iconic stories ever told through the medium of cinema. For the filmmaker, the completion of the project was the realization of a boyhood dream first set in motion nearly 30 years earlier, when a young Peter Jackson would sit and watch the original King Kong. The experience was somewhat of an epiphany, and by the time the film was over, a wide-eyed Jackson would remain forever changed. The youngster had began making short films at the age of 8, featuring handmade special effects. And following his exposure to the 1933 masterpiece, Jackson, now 9 years old, would work on a succession of DIY short films shot on the family's Super 8 camera. He made plasticine dinosaurs and would verse himself in the painstaking process of stop-motion animation. 25 years later, Jackson would say of Kong that film really embodied to me why I make movies. It took you on a journey into a place that never existed, with people that never existed, experiencing adventures that you're never going to experience. Even at 9 years old, while I was totally lost in the film, I knew it was something that was artificial. Therefore, one day I knew I could create this too. Unaware of the fact that film director was even a concept, Jackson would first fancy himself as one day becoming a special effects artist. His first attempt to recreate King Kong on camera was when he was still 12 years old.
You know, in my burst of excitement, I made a little puppet, stop-motion puppet of Kong with wire, joints. I decided I was going to start, the first sequence I was going to really have a go at doing was the Empire State Building. So I'd build the top of the Empire State Building out of cardboard. See, I didn't even bother painting the back of it because I thought we'd only be filming it from the front, so I
Conserved your resources.
Yeah, I consumed my silver paint, must have been in short supply. I got my mother to give me an old sheet that I stretched it on the wall. I pinned it up onto my bedroom wall and stretched it, and I painted the cyclorama of a volcano in a sort of Skull Island prehistoric kind of world to go behind the dinosaurs. And I never got around to building an aeroplane actually for attacking Kong. I got the Empire State Building, then I got Kong. I did some little bit of test shooting of him moving around. I got so far and just realized it was never going to be what I was imagining it to be in my mind. And so I gave up on it eventually and moved on to other things. I mean, I still kept doing stop motion though. I did a thing for a school filmmaking competition when I was about 15 or 16 that had a Cyclops monster in it, or sort of something that looked like Harryhausen's Cyclops. One eye and a horn. It was very much like Ray's Cyclops. So I certainly kept on doing stop motion, but I never really got any further with my remake of Kong, unfortunately.
Called King Kong. King Kong came from the imagination of Marion C. Cooper, the special effects genius of stop-motion technician Willis O'Brien, and the skill and experience of Ernest Schoedsack. O'Brien oversaw special effects. Schoedsack directed the live-action scenes. Cooper directed the technical scenes using techniques such as rear projection and the Dunning and Williams traveling matte process, a method which allowed the directors to shoot the foreground and background separately. Previously shot footage was projected onto a screen, and the live action in front of it was filmed. The pioneering and groundbreaking stop-motion animation techniques, along with some models, were taken from a previously scrapped film called Creation, the aborted RKO fantasy film from which the effects and storyline would directly influence King Kong. The final screenplay was the result of various drafts as the story evolved from initial conception to final execution. The first draft by mystery writer Edgar Wallace was entitled The Beast. Wallace's draft is dated January 5th, 1932, and was completed shortly before his unexpected death. Two further drafts were then written by veteran screenwriter James Ashmore Creelman, The Eighth Wonder and Kong, dated March 9th and June 16th, 1932. And then there was a fourth, undated pre-production script detailing the camera setups for the entire film. Cooper, dissatisfied with Creelman's work, would hire Ruth Rose to finish the job. While Rose had little script writing experience, she had been on several of Cooper and Chodesak's previous film expeditions, and she understood what tone the filmmakers were looking for. In the final story, producer Carl Denham, having heard of a monster, the legendary Kong, a gigantic ape that lives on an unmarked, uncharted Pacific island, Denham decides to charter a ship to go and film it. Being very secretive about his plans, he manages to find a struggling actress, Anne Darrow. Darrow is willing to go along with his plans, with the promise of going on the adventure of a lifetime. Once the ship arrives on the island, the natives capture Anne to sacrifice her to the giant ape, Kong. Kong seizes her and takes her back to his lair. The crew, led by the heroic sailor Jack Driscoll, goes to rescue her, losing many in the fight, but Kong is eventually captured and brought back to New York, where he escapes and climbs atop the Empire State Building with Anne. In one of the most famous scenes in cinematic history, the fierce yet sympathetic Kong safely places Anne to one side, and then battles machine gun fire from swarming planes, which mortally wound him and cause him to plunge to his death. A moment that brought the young Peter Jackson to tears. King Kong opened in New York City on March 2, 1933, with its national release a month later. The picture opened at Radio City Music Hall and the Roxy Theater in New York City simultaneously. The profits from King Kong also saved RKO Pictures, which had gone into receivership on the day of its New York premiere after being hit hard by the Depression. Up to 50,000 people saw it on the day of its premiere, and Kong would go on to set box office records. There were 10 shows daily. In Los Angeles, it premiered at Grauman's Chinese Theater, with the Kong head displayed in the lobby. The inevitable sequel, titled Son of Kong, was rushed out to cash in on the popularity of the original. RKO had decided that a sequel should follow as quickly as possible to figuratively strike while the iron was hot. And so, Chodesak and Cooper immediately began working on it. Chodesak directed solo, and Rose wrote the screenplay, drawing once again on her experiences as a member of the Cooper-Chodesak expeditions. 6 months later, The Son of Kong was completed and released to modest fanfare. O'Brien would later write a screenplay treatment featuring King Kong battling a large humanoid monster created by Dr. Frankenstein's grandson in San Francisco. King Kong vs. Frankenstein, however, would never materialize. And as for the unfortunate reasons of why, well, that's a deep dive for another day. As a result, the Japanese studio Toho licensed the character from RKO and produced 2 films that featured the character, 1962's King Kong vs. Godzilla and 1967's King Kong Escapes. In 1976, Italian producer Dino De Laurentiis released his take on Kong following a war over who owned the rights to what. Despite endless publicity and hype about how closely the film would follow the original, the film was a disappointment to fans, including a teenage Peter Jackson. The 15-year-old had avidly followed the press for the remake in the months leading up to the release. He was early to show up at the first screening hours before anyone else arrived. "I kind of bought into the hype," Jackson would later say. "I convinced myself there would be crowds and crowds of people. There weren't. And like most people, I was disappointed by it." De Laurentiis had moved the action from the 1930s to the present in the 76 remake of King Kong. The film was directed by John Gillerman and had Kong climbing the Twin Towers in the final scene rather than the Empire State Building. De Laurentiis would tell the press that he already had filmed King Kong in Africa based on an original script with his cast returning. Silver Screen Horror magazine reported that King Kong in Africa was already in the can and set for release in 1977. Of course, hindsight tells us a different tale. Though the film was a critical disappointment, it made enough money to warrant a sequel, King Kong Lives, in 1986. And so, as Jackson continued work on The Frighteners, the vice president of Universal Pictures, Lenny Kornberg, had heard on the grapevine that the director was something of King Kong obsessive. The question was put to Jackson officially. "Would you have any interest in doing King Kong?"
Making The Frighteners, we were working with Universal on that particular movie, and we had a call from our executive on The Frighteners, Lenny Kornberg. I think they were seeing dailies of The Frighteners and they were liking what they were seeing, and And Lenny called us and said, there's a couple of horror movies that the studio is wanting to remake, and would either of them interest me? And one was The Creature from the Black Lagoon, which I sort of didn't get too excited about, and the other one was King Kong, which I did get very excited about. And I said to Lenny, because I'd never mentioned Kong to him at all, and I said, you realise this is my favourite film? And he said, oh, really? And it was interesting because I was also aware that Universal in years earlier had attempted to remake King Kong in 1975. When Dino De Laurentiis was doing his version for Paramount, I think it was, Universal were developing a competing version of Kong. So I was reading about that. I remember looking in one of the very first issues of Starlog magazine I ever bought, and they had an article about the competing Kongs in 1975. And so it was weird to be talking to somebody at Universal and basically to being offered to now pick up the reins and do what Universal had failed to do 20 years earlier. And so I was excited. We had to get The Frighteners finished first, which we did.
As the news became public, Jackson would say, "You think it's taken you by surprise? That's nothing to what it's done to me." Universal presented me with the idea and asked if I was interested. As they're clearly going to do it, whether it's by me or not, I thought, okay, but it still hasn't sunk in yet. Jackson remembers this moment, later saying, "I was immediately very fired up, but Fran had never seen the original movie, so we watched it on video together, and once she saw that it could be an enjoyable project to work on, we started getting into serious talks with Universal about Kong. When the call from Lenny came asking if we were interested in King Kong, I was first and foremost excited about the concept of being involved, but secondly, I was just intrigued as a fan. I thought, oh, so Universal still think they've got the rights to do Kong?" And I started interrogating Lenny. I soon realized that I knew a heck of a lot more about it than he did. In fact, he didn't even seem to know that Universal had attempted to make a version in the 70s. When all came to all, it was just as well Jackson raised the issue of rights, as when Kornberg returned to Universal's legal department to go digging through the archives, he discovered that Jackson was correct. The studio didn't actually own the rights to remake the original King Kong movie, but they did own the movie adaptation rights to the original novelization of the 1933 movie. The book of the film, written by Delos W. Lovelace, originally published in the year the film was released, would be their source material on which to base the script. The original novelization of the King Kong screenplay had been commissioned by Marion C. Cooper. The novel was published and released prior to the release of the film as a means of generating hype. Once the news was out, Jackson would speak at the time and say, "I'm fully aware of the responsibility I'm taking on, but the original King Kong is my favorite film of all time. It's the reason why I've been making movies since the age of 12, and it influenced my genre sensibilities forever. We haven't thought about it in any depth and won't be doing so until after the release of The Frighteners, so I have no idea which angle we'll take. All I will tell you is that I'll approach it like every other film I've made. I'll make a movie I want to go and see myself first. Then I'll please the audience second. Computer graphic cinematic techniques are in place today to make it visually very exciting, too. I respect the original King Kong so much, I promise I'll think about everything very seriously over the next few months." Speaking to The Observer, Jackson was quoted as saying, "The fact it's my favorite movie is of some comfort to me, because at least I'm remaking something that's close to my heart. The Hollywood trade magazines would keep a close eye on developments. It was said that the plan was for all filming and effects to be handled within New Zealand." And reports stated that in the winter of 1996, Jackson had traveled to the beach town of Rosarito, near Tijuana, to discuss the part of Ann Darrow with Kate Winslet, who at the time was shooting James Cameron's Titanic. As word traveled that King Kong was getting a remake, other possible casting choices were to include Robert De Niro and George Clooney, said to be fancied strongly for the roles of Jack Driscoll and Carl Denham. Names like Gary Oldman and Bruce Campbell were also placed into the mix. Ian McClellan's name was mentioned in the UK press as an ideal choice to portray Anne's father, Lord Darrow. As Jackson and Walsh began hammering out a first draft, his team would begin a 6-month period of research, scouting and working within Weta Digital to develop the visual effects that were going to present Kong to a modern audience.
all about to go on a big holiday and, and just sort of, relax after the Frighteners. And so Pete sort of, obviously had another project in the wings and let us all know. So, we were all coming back to work on that.
Everybody in the facility sat down and we all read the script. A fun script, but different in tone. A little bit more sort of smart and a little bit more kind of jokey.
It was almost that sort of, classic sort of Hollywood adventure feeling kind of film.
I remember initially the first time we come across Jack, he's a World War I fighter pilot, and he and his buddy are up in their biplanes doing baseball practice, chucking a ball and hitting it back to each other while they're flying along.
I was having a go at everything, really. There was pet creatures, there was dinosaurs, and Kong himself. But it was sort of evened out at that stage. Everyone sort of had a go at everything.
We designed a very classic, very Harryhausen-esque brontosaur, similar to the one that Ray had done for 1 million years BC. I always thought it was actually, quite a similar looking brontosaur, very, very classic.
It's still perceived that we would have to do Kong with animatronic components.
We were going to do the classic Kong's mechanical hand, like they have done in the previous versions, and I know that Weta Workshop had got pretty far advanced with designing and building a mechanical hand rig. We also had a sequence with some crocodiles that attacked a sinking car at one stage, and we were going to be building mechanical animatronic crocodiles that were going to be sort of busting in the windows of the slowly sinking vehicle.
But probably the largest body of work that we started was in 1996. Animatics created digitally were not a reality at this point, or they certainly weren't in our scope of work. So the only way that we could think to pre-visualize the movie in filmic images was to do it with stop animation. Can you imagine? So we set about and in fact made all of the creatures as stop animation armatures. We made 8 brontosaurs. We made the T-Rexes, we made the Carnosaurs, the Raptors, we made all the sailors, all with stop animation armatures. We sculpted them, fiberglass molded them and ran them in foam. When we had all the brontosaurs lined up, it was quite a spectacular array of critters.
I also thought there was something nice about prevising in stop motion, even though the movie was going to be completely computer generated, that it gave us a first pass in the old-fashioned technique. So we'd sort of somehow, that flavour would be inherited by the finished film itself.
About half the people who were working on the show at Digital at that time were working on the digital build of 1933 period New York. And that turned out to be really useful because when we kicked off with King Kong in 2003, when we got back onto that project, the first thing we did was we unloaded that low-resolution New York dataset, and that became our previs environment for pre-visualizing all the New York scenes in King Kong. So what was going to be a hero asset in 1996, 97 became a previs asset for the 2003 version, which I think indicates the degree to which the complexity of the work that we were doing had progressed over the years.
We had tools, don't get me wrong, but they certainly weren't as intuitive as what we're doing now. Back then it was researching looks, doing the modeling of the biplanes themselves, animation tests, environment tests, crash tests, that kind of thing. There was one dogfight test that we did that put these planes in downtown Wellington. It was like a helicopter fly-past shot, and you've got these planes just going at it, burning, catching on fire, shooting buildings, bombs are going off. Good stuff.
Being able to take a digital plane and crash it into the ground and have that look believable was a very complex task that we really had to do a big R&D project on.
This is actually in the days before like pixel tracking or motion tracking or even something like Shake. So all of our matching the buildings happened very laboriously. It was a more painful world doing visual effects in those days.
We never got anywhere close to developing a final Kong puppet or a final CG design.
Into the development of Kong, but had begun to sense that the studio was pulling back. Jackson says, "I'm in a hotel in London late at night on the day I arrived, and I'm talking with studio head Casey Silver himself. Everything seemed to be doublespeak. He didn't come out and say, 'We just don't think that we want to make Kong anymore,' or 'The time's not right for Kong,' or whatever. It was more a case of, 'Well, what we really want to do is just pause for a moment in the development of the film. We think perhaps you should do some more work on the screenplay. That would be good, and then we'll take a breath and we'll wait till the script has gone to another draft, and then maybe we can start picking it up again.' But of course it was impossible because without any money, we were going to lose everybody who was working on the film. Jackson then received a call from his agent. "They're pulling the plug on King Kong," a deflated Jackson was told.
By January 97, which was about 6 or 7 months after we'd gotten underway, we had the plug pulled on us suddenly.
As I understand it, which I think is, as everyone else understands it, Universal got cold feet because there was Godzilla and Mighty Joe Young due to come out that year. It's another movie about a big gorilla and another movie about a monster terrorizing New York City.
So Universal were looking at being the third place out of 3 monster movies. And so in the beginning of 97, it just started to feel wrong. And within a few weeks, it just spiraled downhill and was sort of over and done. Blink, finished, bang.
I remember Charlie McClellan, the visual effects producer, he'd obviously got the call. He sort of came in and he had the schedule all up on the board, and he just grabbed the schedule and just ripped it off.
Yeah, we kind of, went round to one of our colleagues' place and drowned our sorrows a little bit and tried to put a brave face on it.
Yeah, there were tears. Some people were really quite upset.
People had become very emotionally involved. For many of us, it was our first big film project, and so we invested ourselves completely in it.
Back then we had sculpted this wonderful maquette of Kong fighting these 3 dinosaurs, this really big model that we gave as a gift to the studio. It was like one of my trips to LA to have a script meeting. I took this big model. I lugged this thing across in a carton and assembled it in the hotel in LA, and then took it to Universal and presented it to them as a thank you at one of our meetings. And then when they killed the movie, I called them up and said, "Send me my model back." And we got it back, and it's a model that's been sitting in the lobby of Weta Workshop for the last 8 or 9 years. And everybody that came to the workshop would go, "Oh wow, look at this!" And it was always a slightly bittersweet feeling because I look at it and it was always represented the film that didn't happen. So I was really pleased to finally be able to get that T-Rex fight out of my system, because that one had certainly been stuck in my head for quite a long time.
In Hollywood, the term twin films is used to describe a common phenomena whereby 2 films with the same or very similar plot are produced or released at the same time by 2 different film studios, often resulting in a messy and sometimes costly race to distribute the films first. As well as Godzilla and Mighty Joe Young, Jackson also had to contend with another studio race against the clock. Jackson would tell Ian Nathan that Universal had just won a very expensive race against 20th Century Fox between Dante's Peak and Volcano. There was only going to be room for 1 Volcano film on the market. Universal won that battle, but it cost a huge amount of money to fast-track post-production. They looked at this race in terms of the 3 giant monster movies, and another ape film that was a little further behind in development didn't add up. Unless King Kong could be the first one out, they didn't want to do it. In the first few weeks of 1997, as Universal seemed to be getting increasingly nervous about the other 2 creature pictures, it began to feel as if the heart of this film was fading away. Fran and I were trying to figure out some way to do Kong quicker or to alleviate their fears, but there was no doubting the fact that the subject matter of these 3 movies was very similar, and therefore nothing we could really say. Not only was Jackson a bystander victim of internal studio politics and one-upsmanship, but the Frighteners would eventually recede into the enormous shadow cast by that summer's hit blockbuster, Independence Day, and the fact that America was also hosting the Summer Olympics. Jackson now had the hellish task of informing his talented crew that the show was over and unemployment was imminent. He abandoned the promotional work on the Frighteners and bought himself a ticket for the next plane home. Jackson would later say, "It is the only time in my life I've ever done that. I did not sleep at all as I was dealing with all of this. So I went there and back. Again, I'd flown 27 hours to London straight through in order to promote the Frighteners. Had ended up not doing a single bit of publicity for the film, lost my next movie, and less than 24 hours later was flying home again, all without having had a wink of sleep. I had a copy of The Lord of the Rings with me, and I remember thinking I needed to take my mind off the problems we were facing, and that this book might now be our only hope. So I curled up on the plane home, opened the book, and started reading Tolkien's prologue concerning hobbits. But I'd been awake for hours and hours on end and was so totally exhausted that I only got through 3 or 4 pages before I fell fast asleep. When he got back to New Zealand, he drove straight to the Weta workshop. He gathered his staff together and told them the film was over. Kong was dead. Weta's Richard Taylor would later tell Ian Neathan that, "We gathered the whole crew together in the area that's now our sculpting room, outside the lunchroom, and we told them that the project was off. There were some tears and pretty sad people. This was a desperate state of affairs. Universal had insisted that Weta Digital engage a large number of people on a 2-year contract, and now they were dropping the film. We were in the unenviable position of having all of these contracts that we had to pay out. And Weta was still a fledgling company with a very small infrastructure financially, so we were left in a real quandary." There was brief talk of Jackson resurrecting his 1992 renaissance of Planet of the Apes treatment, now with James Cameron attached as an active producer, and Arnold Schwarzenegger keen to star. Jackson says, "We repitched exactly the same idea to these 2 high-powered Fox executives who'd never heard it before. Once again, it was met with a lot of enthusiasm, but then they launched into this long explanation about how they'd spent a lot of money developing a potential Planet of the Apes film. Though not with us, because we'd worked on spec and never earned a cent, and how they already had 1 or 2 failed screenplays. We heard of various versions, including one by Terry Hayes, who wrote Mad Max 2 and 3 and went on to write Vertical Limit. Anyway, at the end of this preamble, they said that they'd like to use our story, have Fran and I write the script and me direct, but they also wanted James Cameron to produce it and for Arnold Schwarzenegger to star in it. We have had a real commitment," they said, "for this to be a vehicle for Schwarzenegger. Why not meet with James Cameron before you leave town and pitch him your ideas? We think as a group you'll make a great team." Apes was another project that would ultimately die on the vine in a sequence of events that, again, is a deep dive for another day. Jackson and Weta's fortunes would soon shift, however, and a deal to adapt The Lord of the Rings into a trilogy of movies was made with New Line Cinema. A mammoth and ambitious task that would span 1997 to 2004. The trilogy would earn $2.991 billion at the box office and win 17 Oscars in the process. Jackson was now on top of the world, and in a position to flex his creative muscles and do whatever he wanted. And of course, what he wanted to do was King Kong.
What happened when King Kong got canned is that Pete immediately asked us to start doing some design work for The Hobbit.
Something was up. We didn't know what exactly, but it then changed to Lord of the Rings, which then was suddenly like, okay.
It was strange during Lord of the Rings because Weta Workshop had all of our Kong models from 1996, and they were all up on a shelf in the sculpting room. And so all the way through Lord of the Rings for like 6 or 7 years, I'd go in for numerous meetings into the sculpting room, and I'd always step in the door and be reminded of Kong. So I did spend 6 or 7 years being kind of tormented and tortured by looking at all these things of the film that never happened.
I think it was possibly a good thing that nothing happened. I think it would have been a different film then. I don't think it would have been as emotive, and I don't think that the story would have evolved as much as it did.
But for me, it was always unfinished business. It was a dream that I'd wanted since I was a kid that had been unfulfilled in a way that wasn't particularly pleasant back in 1996. And I'd always feel a little pang of disappointment that that was the film that I wish I could have made that I never did get made.
During post-production on Rings, Jackson was asked whether or not his canceled version of King Kong stood a chance of revival. Jackson replied, "Universal owns the rights to our script, so it would have to be something they want to do. But let's just see, I guess. If Lord of the Rings is successful, it may inspire someone to look at the project again. I'm definitely inspired to be connected with it. Kong is my favorite film of all time, and I certainly liked the script we wrote. I was very pleased with it, even though it needed a little bit more work. It was a faithful, yet slightly original homage that would have been quite fun to make." Weta's Richard Taylor would later reflect on the canceled Kong experience, saying, "We were all heartbroken at the time because we thought we had lost the greatest opportunity of our careers. But today, we appreciate that it was a blessing in disguise. First of all, I question whether we were well enough equipped to do justice to the story in 1996. And secondly, Rings may never have been made if we'd done Kong then." Jackson would also appreciate the lessons learned making the Rings trilogy. He said, "We learned it all from The Lord of the Rings. We just didn't like the old script. It was lightweight and flippant, and trying desperately hard to be a cool Indiana Jones-style movie. This is a point Jackson would reiterate over the coming weeks, telling journalists, "As much as I like being angry at then Universal Studio chief Casey Silver for killing the film, which was literally the blackest day in my entire career, in hindsight, you can't but be grateful it didn't happen. And I don't even like our old script. I don't think there's a single line of dialogue that's the same."
So it was really nice when we got a phone call from Universal asking us if we were interested in revisiting King Kong.
I think Peter gave us the first intimation that the show was going to go about midway through Return of the King.
So sorry we're late. We were just having a look at Real Tuna. I believe we're supposed to finish it for a premiere soon.
At the point that we were starting to work on Kong, we still had the majority of Return of the King shots to deliver. You know, we would have only had a handful of shots final on film 3 at that point.
We're in the thick of it. It was just Return of the King, Return of the King. The thought that anything else was going on was mind-boggling.
We were exhausted. We were all pretty tired coming out of Lord of the Rings, and then we went straight into this.
Most of the people who worked with us on Lord of the Rings carried through. It was just that same old team crashing along, you know, and it was great.
Universal approached Jackson during the post-production of The Return of the King, concerning his interest in restarting development on King Kong. In March 2003, Universal set a target December 2005 release date, and Jackson and Walsh brought the Lord of the Rings co-writer Philippa Boyens on to help rewrite their 1996 script. Speaking about his new screenplay, Jackson said, "When Philippa joined us, it gave us the chance for a fresh start. We're better writers now than we were in 1996. And our new script is based on the 1933 movie, not on the 1996 script. In hindsight, fate has been kind to us because this movie will be so much better than the 1996 film would have been." Commenting on the first King Kong drafts, Boyan said, "That was actually just Fran and Peter very hurriedly getting something down on paper. You wouldn't even call it a concept drawing. It was more one of many possible ways the story could go. Now, Peter's mad genius is going to be truly unleashed. I have a feeling that Return of the King will look relatively restrained next to King Kong. I think it'll be quite fantastic." As for the screenplay in question, there's a first draft dated 1996 and a second draft dated 1997. The tone has often been compared to 1999's The Mummy, the Brendan Fraser movie that carried the spirit of a 1920s monster adventure crossed with Saturday morning serials of the 30s. A fact not lost on the filmmakers themselves.
It had the sort of same tone as The Mummy, I guess.
When I saw The Mummy, I thought, did they read the King Kong script? You know, it was almost that sort of, you know, classic sort of Hollywood adventure.
It's no surprise, really, when you consider that the man who initially posed the question, "Would you like to direct King Kong?" to Jackson in the first place, Lenny Kornberg, was the man who, 3 years later, would liberate The Mummy from ongoing development hell. The Mummy's screenplay at the time had been much more of a straight horror film, and it was Kornberg who helped steer and transform the tone into one of thrills, wacky adventure, self-awareness, and high camp. It's also notable how the dynamic between Jackson's 1996 Jack Driscoll and Ann Darrow is not too dissimilar from the interplay between Rick O'Connell and Evelyn Carnahan in The Mummy. While Jackson's more streamlined 90s vision isn't a million miles away from the film he would eventually make, there are several differences. In particular, with the setup and establishing of the characters' motivations. The opening prologue opens in the skies over France during World War I. We meet 17-year-old fighter pilot Jack Driscoll and his pal Matt Hammond. They engage in a dogfight with German bombers. Jack and Matt are ambushed and outnumbered as machine gun fire rips through their aircrafts. They crash to the ground in no man's land. Matt saves Jack before he is killed by a German soldier. A traumatized Jack suffers survivor's guilt and vows never to fly again. We then move to 1933 Sumatra. We meet the elderly Lord Linwood Darrow and his attractive daughter Anne on an archaeological expedition working on behalf of the British Museum. Also present in Sumatra is Carl Denham, described as a showman, larger than life, a man in love with his own legend. He has a reputation for traveling to the most dangerous corners of the world, producing exotic documentaries, and is here to film the locals. Jack Driscoll is now in his 30s and works in the area as a deforester and runs a sawmill in the area. He and Denham clash immediately. As Denham tramples over the island and insults the local culture, his cameraman is attacked by a Sumerian tiger. As Denham films the chaos, the tiger is diverted to Lord Darrow's excavation site. Denham is in pursuit in his jeep, shooting wildly at the tiger. His bullets ricochet around as ancient, priceless artifacts are destroyed. It's a happy accident, however, as the shell of a large Buddha statue gives way, revealing another statue behind it. A large, fierce, monstrous, ape-like creature that sits atop a pile of human skulls. Lord Darrow recognizes this as the legendary beast known as Kong. They discover a map to the fabled Island of the Skull. Lord Darrow suffers a fatal heart attack as the Sumerian government show up to close down the dig and begin destroying all of their work. Once the ambitiously megalomaniacal Denham hears of Skull Island, the lure of potentially filming a barbaric tribe of natives is too strong. He knows this could make for a great film. He convinces Jack, Anne, and the ship's skipper, Captain Engelhorn, to mount an expedition to the mysterious location. The rest of the Jackson and Walsh second draft follows the original 1933 Kong quite faithfully. Anne is kidnapped by the island's natives and taken to be a sacrifice. Kong saves Anne and takes her into the jungle. Kong is pursued by Denham, Jack, and the sailors, who are attacked by a multitude of dinosaurs and giant, terrifying hybrid insect creatures. Kong saves Anne by battling 3 allosaurs at once. Kong develops a primal affection for Anne, and as he again defends her from an attack by the island's creatures, Jack appears and rescues Anne in death-defying circumstances. Jack spears Kong, and Denham shoots Kong's knees with his Tommy gun as sailors begin to club the wounded giant ape. Once back in New York, Kong is unveiled to the world in chains as the 8th wonder of the world. Different to the eventual 2005 release is that Denham is much more cruel toward Kong, and when Kong escapes, Denham meets his demise as Kong steps on him. As fighter planes circle Kong atop the Empire State Building and spray him with bullets, Jack Driscoll jumps into his own plane for the first time since the war. In the build-up to 2005's Kong remake, Jackson would further distance himself from the cancelled '96 draft, saying, "Our first script was sort of Indiana Jones-ish and rather flippant. It was what I regard as a very Hollywood script. But now, what we've come to like with The Lord of the Rings is the approach of making the situations feel very real, even though we're dealing with extraordinary situations and weird characters like elves, hobbits, trolls, and the like. We didn't let the fantastic nature of the story dictate the tone. We decided that that was the approach we want to take with Kong as well." And so, we end where we began. On December 5th, 2005, New York hosted the international premiere of Peter Jackson's King Kong, an epic, ambitious, big-budget retelling of one of the most enduring and iconic stories ever told through the medium of cinema. For the filmmaker, the completion of the project was the realization of a boyhood dream first set in motion nearly 30 years earlier. A young Peter Jackson would sit and watch the original King Kong. The experience was an epiphany, and by the time the film was over, a wide-eyed Jackson would remain forever changed, as would the future of cinema. As always, thanks for watching.